Welcome. It's really great to see such a full room. My name is Diana Magnuson. I'm from the Institute of Social Research and Data Innovation at the University of Minnesota. And just a couple of housekeeping items for our session today. This is a data management and archiving session, and we have 4 papers being presented. Each paper will have 15 minutes. I'm going to introduce each paper before the paper is presented. We'll hold all the questions until the end, and Jen is monitoring the Zoom link. And we will have, audience will be mic'd, so you can ask your question. And just a reminder to our participants, our panelists, that they need to stay close here so that our virtual audience can hear us clearly. So our first presenter is John Petters, and he is an Assistant Director of Data Management and Curation Services. John supervises a team that provides research data management planning, training, and curation support, and including geospatial data services to researchers across Virginia Tech through the university libraries.
All right, hi everybody. Hello. Hi. Let me get the slides in the slide appropriate format. Okay, yeah, so hi, John Petters, Virginia Tech Data Services and Libraries. I'm here to talk about a work I've done with Kouper at Indiana University, Thea Lindquist, UC Boulder, and Eche Gumasel at Indiana. And I should say Ina and Eche get the credit for the material you're looking at here today. They got together on the mouthpiece for the work. So, diversity in data, lessons from interdisciplinary practices. So a little background on the work we're looking at here. So we're looking at something called, we use an acronym for the project we had, Interdisciplinary and Highly Collaborative Research, IHCR. You may see this acronym a few times. Combining knowledge and expertise across domains, communities, and organizations. So not doing research within one community or one domain, but multiple, and the complexities that arise. So we had a project funded by IMLS, as a US-based project, Institute for Museum and Library Sciences. And the project is a multi-method study, including interviews, case studies, observations, and document analysis. Project is wrapping up as of end of August this year. And what we did, we looked at several different interdisciplinary research projects across a wide range of scholarship: sciences, social sciences, digital humanities, computational sciences. And here's a little, at the bottom here, a little quick look at the different projects we were working with: Midwest mapping, US mapping, and ecology, sustainable food systems, histories of the slave trade, specialty crops production, agricultural research, urban green infrastructures, and humanities project trends in rural communities. So a wide variety of different scholarship and looking at their data practices within this kind of work. I'm not going to talk in great detail about individual projects, where they were, and details about them, because we didn't tell our research participants we were going to share all that detailed information. So we're going to talk more about the generalities that we have learned in thinking about diversity with respect to these projects. So, an important thing about interdisciplinary or highly collaborative research, a lot of previous studies have focused on the team dynamics in these kind of researches. The science of team science, have you ever heard that phrase before? And here we're not trying to focus on that. We're not trying to look at how people are necessarily interacting and approaching their research questions, and focusing more on the technical and ethical challenges of working in with these complex heterogeneous data sets that are addressed and used in this kind of work. Doesn't mean we can ignore team dynamics. They're important. They're people, they're working together, and they have different ideas how to do work. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but we're trying to focus more on the data that's generated and the practices around that data. So that's what we'll be talking a little bit more on. Filling a gap in the detailed exploration of this kind of data management practices and the complexity and challenges that arise, and then how we can help assuage them going forward. So a couple of questions we were looking at in doing this work, and here we're going to focus more on the diversity aspect of the work. There's other aspects, of course, but in keeping with the theme of the conference. How do interdisciplinary project members negotiate their work around diverse data sets? What role do ethics play, diversity and ethics play in data practices? And where it's appropriate, not every research project was dealing with human participants, but where they were, how do those teams approach privacy and confidentiality as they collect, store, and organize these heterogeneous and complex data sets? So, things we found as we were working on this thing. So one is about the diversity of the research team. So again, can't get away from team dynamics and the researchers themselves. When you ask researchers in doing this research, and they're doing their interdisciplinary, highly collaborative research, what does diversity mean to you? How does the diversity mean to the research project you're doing? And there's a diversity of diversity things that the people thought about. That's one of the issues in diversity, right? Defined in many various ways. So researchers that we talked about diversity in race, and gender, and nationality, and career stage, experience, skill level, the different groups of people who are being brought together to do the work. A general awareness of the importance in this. Nobody, when we asked them about diversity, said, oh, we don't worry about that at all. Everybody considered it as an important aspect in one form or another, but didn't necessarily talk about it all in the same way. So topical awareness in some particular case studies that we were talking about, there is a real focus on it. You know, talking about the histories of the slave trade, talking about sustainable food systems. This became much more of an import, related directly to the topic, where in some of the other case studies, not as much. Talking about diversity in the research teams, often the members we talked to would say, well, that's the PI's responsibility to worry about diversity in the research team, not my responsibility. Not in every case, but often it was deferred to the leadership. Whether or not there is a relationship or conflict between research quality and diversity is an interesting thing to hear. I wouldn't say there would be, but. And the importance of diversity and what it means did change and differ across genders and across career status. So the data itself. If we talk about the diversity in the research data, what does diversity mean in research data? Well, it could mean diversity across populations that we're gathering the data from samples gathering from, associated with economic status, changes in economic status, racial diversity in humans, genetic diversity in crops. Many different ways research data can be diverse, and we were searching for diversity in the research we're doing. Diversity in the sources of the data, wide range of temporal spatial scales, diversity in access constraints, the human participant pool, or whether we have appropriate diversity in the pool of people we're working with if we're doing human subjects research. In some cases this was important, in some cases it was not. Trying to work with multiple technologies to support all these multiple data types coming from different disciplines, different communities. The complexity can get quite large. And diversity in vocabularies. One particular example I'm going to bring out here about describing things within this particular research. Regions involved in the slave trade. Do we use colonial definitions of regions that are associated with the slave trade, or do you use what the indigenous folks there would be using? And which ones are going to be best for describing and communicating this research to which groups? Lots of complexity. I'm going to say the word complexity a lot because it's important. Challenges within these projects. So negotiating disciplinary background and experiences. Political scientists working with a civil engineer, they have different experiences, different ways of thinking about research, different research methods, different tools, different data formats, coming together and working together. They have things to resolve. Whether or not they think about it, they have things to resolve. How do we get consensus for these kind of things, or reaching a compromise in bringing our data practices together as different folks? When we're figuring out this consensus or reaching this compromise, who's making these choices? Is it the PI at the top? The PI at the top, I should be on top, because these are faculty members, right? Or are they coming together collaboratively to figure out how to resolve differences in how things are looked at? Again, multiple tools, multiple applications, multiple data sources, multiple storage services. One institution uses one cloud storage service as D1, and another institution uses a different one. Which one do you use? That was a problem in many of the cases. And training and support for handling this kind of data is not something that was easy to find for these researchers to find at their respective institutions or across their institutions. So muddling through was a common strategy. So that's the lessons to learn. Better teams are created with intention and awareness of these dynamics and about the diversity of data. For people who do data management consulting, this will be a shocking thing. Hey, we should talk about these things from the outset, as opposed to figuring it out halfway through the project. Amazing punchline, I'm sure. The importance of documenting and documentation and transparency in this data management is important for regular one single disciplinary research project. It's even more important when you're working with multiple disciplines, multiple communities, multiple organizations. Having a need for more ethics education around data and how it's associated with these different cases. In some of these cases in research, the researchers were very tuned into these ethics concerns, and other ones, not so much. And emphasizing actions to make this data reusable during its active management, as opposed to worrying about making the data reusable at the very end of the project. Hey, we should think about this throughout the course of our project. So a couple things to say as conclusion things. Effective interdisciplinary team data set practices, confidentiality data, addressing diversity and heterogeneity in the data. Thinking about these things from the outset is crucial for making these research projects more successful. And prioritizing good communication, collaboration within the teams, good proper data management, addressing ethical privacy concerns, considering diversity, heterogeneity, complexity of the data being collected and analyzed is really important too. I would say, so the important thing I would say is with respect to this kind of research, this is all good project management practices as a whole for effective research in general, but this is even more so important when you're dealing with very complex data and complex research that's happening when it's across disciplines, communities, and organizations. So it's even more so important in this case. Muddling through is a more perilous thing to do in this case. So this is just, again, just one little aspect of our research here. The project hub is going to be available on GitHub, where that's being added to like as we speak, and will eventually be archived, I think, in Zenodo is what I'm pushing for, that address other things around this interdisciplinary research, and hopefully we develop some outputs that'll be useful for you if you're trying to support this kind of work. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Our second presenter is Robert Downs, and he serves as the Senior Digital Archivist and Acting Head of Cyber Infrastructure and Informatics Research and Development at the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, a research and data center of the Columbia Climate School of Columbia University. He has many research interests. His research interests include the development, management, use, evaluation, and scientific impact of data systems, digital libraries and repositories, digital preservation, data management, data policy, data confidentiality, software reuse, participatory design, business process redesign, and organizational change. I think you should meet with him.
Thank you very much, Diana. Let's see. Great. So I'm here to talk a little bit today about data citations. For those who've been going to IASSIST in the past, you might recall that we've been conducting a lot of studies about data citations. And the reason that we do that is because it helps us to understand who our users are. That is, we look at studies where our data were cited and we can see how they use the data, which data products are getting used, which tools are getting used, et cetera. And that helps us to understand what we should be doing next. So for this particular study, we have a bunch of us on the author team, and it was a lot of work. In addition to myself, we have Bob Chen, who's talked here at IASSIST many times, Joe Schumacher, who is here over at our table. Here we have a table in the hallway there. And We also have Alex de Sherbinin. He's the Deputy CDAC Director, and he's also the the Deputy Director of Season 2 now. And Susana Adamo, who many of you might know, and Lisa Lu Kong. So working together, we've done this little study just looking at citations of data from 2021 and 2022. The reason we've done this is our user working group, who represent the users, and they rotate in and out of our user working group. So we get new ones in, they're saying, well, how do we represent the users when we're just a subset of the users? It's always evolving. And they said that they would like more information about our current usage. So we really jumped at the chance to do this study, and we're excited to be able to talk about this. And so what we did is we collected bibliographic information on these publications, articles basically for this study, that cited CDAC data. And we composed various categories of questions about the authorship, about the journals themselves, which data sets were cited, whether they were cited with remote sensing data, and if so, which remote sensing data were they cited with, the type of use that they engaged in for the data, and how the data were cited, and then any tools used. So we'll be talking about some of these things. This study is based on the methodology that Bob Chen, myself, and Joe Schumacher employed, it was 10 years ago. Time really flies. Wow. Of course, we lost a few years there recently. And so for this, we did this in December of 2022. We started this study because we wanted to get going on this. And at that point in time, we had over 1,400 articles for those 2 years. And so we selected 75 of them to do this in-depth analysis. And so what we did is we divided up the questions amongst the team members and then looked at each article. And, I guess I'm being a bit casual about the word looked. There was a lot of analysis required just in determining the answers to our questions. And so from the journals themselves, we got a lot of information about the authors and the affiliations of the authors, and from that also the countries. And so you can see here the countries that were most represented by all of the authors of the articles. And so you see here, most of them are coming from China, a lot from the US, but in the United Kingdom, of course, but a lot of other countries are represented in there too. We also looked at the first affiliation of the first authors. And so what we did is looked at their department, and based on their department, we used the Web of Science research areas to categorize them. And so you can see most of them are in departments associated with the environmental sciences and ecology. But it was a little surprising to see business and economics, but that might be the way that the research areas are categorized in by Web of Science. We also see, geography and physical geography, and they're kind of expected, as well as meteorology and atmospheric sciences. But, we're seeing medical informatics in there, some information in library science in there, and infectious diseases. So it's really quite diversified. And this is just a set of, or subset of 75 articles taken at random. So we took all the common keywords and just looked at their frequency and This is one of those word clouds, and you can see, though, based on the size, the terminology that was used most often for the keywords selected by the authors. So it's kind of interesting, and I guess it's expected, to see environmental and climate change in there a lot, but a lot of these other terms, such as species and people looking at water and carbon and risk, these kinds of things. It shows a little bit more about the diversity of our data. And then looking at the data sets that were cited, which are organized within collections on our website, and we have 50 collections currently, and over 200 data sets amongst them. And here you can see the front runner, of course, is the gridded population of the world version 3 or version 4, and actually version 3 gets some use still. For those of you who are familiar with our data, that's kind of the flagship data set that we've been developing for over 20 years. It's a lot of effort there. But it's also interesting to see the satellite-derived environmental indicators and the global high-resolution urban data from Landsat in Last of the Wild. They're getting a lot of use too. And then these are the actual data sets that were cited, and of course you can't read them, but you can see that a lot of them are associated with the GPW version 4 and the satellite-derived environmental indicators in the Last of the Wild. And then we also look at the secondary CDAC data set. So some papers, they used more than one CDAC data set. And so we looked at them as well. And of course, gridded population of the world version 4 was up there as well. And so we were looking at the remote sensing data that were cited a lot, and we weren't really sure how to represent this, but most of the papers are really just talking about these in acronyms, and if you spell them all out, it's just, some of the titles would only fit one title on this slide. So it's interesting though, and some of you might be familiar with some of the terms like Landsat and MODIS and DMS POLS, which is the nighttime lights. And so those are kind of the most popular ones, but you see some of the others that are in there as well. And so looking at data use, in terms of use for a statistical model, we had a lot of contenders in there, so there were like 34 of the articles were looking at a statistical model. And then in terms of simulation models, here we even had more use of the data, where it was like 37, it looks like, articles were using the simulation model. And then for data integration, that is where they might take one data product and merge it with another data product, or use like variables from one data product with variables from one or more other data products. We refer to that as data integration. And you see many about half of the data sets or articles were doing that as well. So that's interesting. And then looking at the tools that were used just for the statistical analysis, we see most of them are using some kind of flavor of R and Python. And it's interesting to see, over time, these things kind of change the tools that people decide to use. And then in terms of the GIS and spatial analysis tools that were used, we see the Google Earth Engine and ArcGIS are really the front runners in there. But we also have in terms of database and file management tools, people reported using ArcGIS and Esri file geodatabase. And then in terms of workflow tools, people were talking about the Python notebook or the Jupyter notebook or some kind of combination of those. So that was a little bit interesting as well to see. And so our conclusions are that there's diversity amongst the author team, sizes, their institutional affiliations, the country affiliations, and the disciplines that they represent. And you can see also that the data, some being used for statistics, others for the modeling and projections, things like that, and for integration as well. And then we see a variety of tools being used too. So one thing we should be talking though about are the limitations of this kind of study. And so these references, first of all, they're collected manually. And so that's dependent on us being able to find who cited our data. And for those of you who engage in that kind of an activity, you might recognize that it's largely dependent on how well they cite the data too. If it gets in the reference section, that's helpful. And if they can put in the DOI for the data, that can be really helpful too. And it's nice when they can get the titles, et cetera. But so, we don't know whether we found them all, but we try to because they help us. And it is a random sample, only 75 articles, around 5%. But these are for 2021 and 2022, so it does fairly represent current use in a way. And we did manually collect this information from the journals, and speaking, at least for myself, but I suspect that we all felt this way, it was very time consuming. Some articles, the way people describe their work is not so easy to understand sometimes. And so, and we manually collected that information, and we might not have discovered everything about an article. Perhaps you have to read between the lines in some, and because we had so many to do. And it really, even though there were a bunch of us on the team, we, it was a lot of work, so we might have missed some things in there. So anyway, thank you very much for your time.
Sophia Adeyeye is our next presenter. She's a lecturer at the Department of Information Management, Leeds City University, an elected member of the IFLA Standing Committee on Education and Training. Her research interests are bibliotherapy, innovation and creativity in school library, indigenous knowledge, and LIS pedagogy. Her co-author is Taofeek Oladokun, and they are a librarian at Leeds University Library, and he has written extensively on the application of emerging technology in the provision of library services. His research interests include digital information systems and information user behavior.
Oh. Okay. Hi, good day, everyone. I'm Sophia Adeyeye, like she already said, and I'm here to present gay rights research and advocacy in Nigeria a place of data mining and data visualization. This idea was conceived sometimes ago when I attended a workshop on social inclusion. And throughout the workshop, everything that was said about social inclusion was actually about digital inclusion and the aspect of gender. So I started thinking what exactly is wrong, that social inclusion should not just include, talking about gender and digital inclusion. Like I said, I work in the library school and the other person works in the library. So I asked him if we have information resources that these particular people can have access to. He said no. So we started looking at libraries within our local area, extending it to the state, and eventually we got to see that we don't actually have something like that. Though this particular set of people are not captured within our space in Nigeria. And they are not just captured, they are labeled. They are labeled, and for us in Nigeria, it is a deviant social orientation. That is, it is deviant, it is not natural. They are labeled, and I started, and it is frowned upon. Whoever comes out, but that does not really mean they don't exist. And I asked questions. I kept, asking people questions, reading about it, and I noticed that these are discussed in hush situation. Nobody's bold enough to talk about it because the government itself has criminalized this particular set of people, and so many things are actually lost in the process. Those people that are involved don't have access to information resources, and currently in Nigeria, there is a 14 years imprisonment for anybody that is caught that is indulging in this sexual orientation. And why the criminalization of being a gay is considered by liberals to be cruel, there is a significant anti-gay sentiment in Nigeria. This can be ascertained from Okolawan's study of 2020. Apart from that, they are often seen, like I said at the beginning, as an anomaly that is even more than catching up a disease called leprosy. In Nigeria, when people have leprosy, they are isolated to the border town, and considering this set of people as much as using same yardstick to define them, according to this NOI 2015. Then also spiritualists and spiritualism in Nigeria and Africa also consider them as abnormal, and they go as far as using spiritual exercise to, I don't know if you understand it, to try and remove that spirit in them. They call it casting out the demon in them. It's as bad as that. And as a result, gay people are prone to molestation. Their rights are denied, and eventually leads to discrimination. There so many stories, unfounded stories around them. Parents actually making sure their children don't read or get to go near people that are categorized as gay. Information and data war. To justify the maltreatment of gay people in Nigeria, both the government and citizens often cited dubious data and information because in the first instance, we don't have data. There is no data about them. And I kept wondering, how come they have data on them because nobody comes out to actually say, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I have this particular sexual orientation. The only orientation we are made to know and understand is, I'm going to use this, the normal male-female relationship. That is, so each time they roll up data, I keep wondering where they got the data from because nobody has let me say most people, I will not say nobody because there is a foundation that is working on that. But for most of us, we don't have the willpower or strength to come out and declare our sexual orientation. There is a high level of anti-homosexuality propaganda, and this is targeted at this set of people in Nigeria. And they have different ways of putting it out across. You have homosexuality is not African. And for me, like today I was discussing with another participant, she asked me, oh, what are you presenting? I told her. And, each side, okay, right from the time this paper was accepted, I've got negative notes from people. I was so happy to share the news that, I'll be going to IASSIST to present a paper. And when I mentioned the title, I get to see this weird look that, are you promoting this? Are you doing? But for me, I think they are human, they exist, they are created by God, and they should have access to information. And also, the government will be doing itself a lot of good by actually having data that researchers can work on. So, you have another one as gay people are cultists. A lot. And the fact remains that apart from being a gay, we have religious people as cultists, but nobody's actually talking about that. People can still look away from religious activities that are quoted in a lot of things that other people see as not being normal. But, for this set of people, we have things going, people really coming out against them. So how do we change minds and attitude? For me, I think for us, the two of us, we want to look at advocacy. The government should allow that. The government should allow people to express their sexual orientation, who they are, without fear, without being coerced. Because the divorce rate in Nigeria is very, very high. And reading through literatures, papers, social media, for most of them, you see people keep it quiet to actually obey their parents. They get married to the opposite sex, and after a while, they cannot continue because who they are will actually reflect at the end of the day. You see a marriage of 6 months, a year, 2 years, crashing. For us in Nigeria, we invest a lot into marriages because there's something we call ashwebi. We do a lot of party, and you can imagine investing so much, and it takes just 6 or 7 or a year for it to crash because the parties involved are not bold enough to actually discuss their sexual orientation, maybe with their pastor, with their priest, with their parents, with their partners. So for us, we think, advocacy will go a long way so that people can really decide who they are and fit into who they are. So we have different, several studies, Makanjuola, Afolayan, and others. With these studies, there is a gradual change. In fact, after all the studies, we noticed that the percentage of people that disagree with being LGBTQ has risen from 8% to 13%. People are gradually coming out to actually discuss this. Researchers are bringing new information about this set of people, that is who they are. They don't have to hide or out of fear, because, like I said at the beginning, that there is this criminalization of being a gay in Nigeria. So we have data for advocacy. Like I said, that we have different foundations, but the prominent one is this BC Alimi Foundation. And this particular person have to live outside Nigeria to be able to do this. It's not in Nigeria, because you cannot do this. You cannot publicly announce or own up to your sexual orientation. It must be the normal male-female sexual orientation. So we have a BC Alimi Foundation doing a lot, pushing out data and telling people that it's normal, it's okay to be this, and other related things like that. So this shows that there is need for data professionals in Nigeria to deploy more expertise. Like I said, in all of our libraries, I put it out there, in Nigeria, there are no resources. I'm a librarian, I teach in the library school. There are no resources to even confirm, to help whoever fall into this category. There is no resources. We don't buy. We don't accept gift. When we accept gift, at the point of processing, if you notice any information that we think is outside the box, we don't shelf such books. We don't share information about such things, and so there is need for us as data professionals, if we really want to be inclusive, including other people, including reaching out to diverse people So we have different resources, and I remember very well in the morning when we were having African session meeting with Linda. She said that as a librarian, we don't have to really know how to do all these things, but we can collaborate. We can collaborate, having to know all this. These are just data mining resources that could really help in putting like a picture to the data, because at times you need to really use other resources to put it out there that, this is this, this is this. So we have examples of data visualization tools that librarians can use to put out data. In conclusion, information and data management professionals in Nigeria has a big role to play in promoting freedom, justice, equity, and other fundamental human rights. This extends to bringing the power of systematically collecting, organize, analyze data presented in a clear and easily understandable format to support the rights of gay people in Nigeria who are facing all forms of discrimination. Also, the scattered and focused data relating to the plight of gay people in Nigeria can be better managed through efforts such as data mining and then used for advocacy through data visualization. It is certain that factual stories of hope, resilience, and triumph of minority groups, because they are minority group in Nigeria, such as gay people, can better be told with the help of information and data professional. Thank you.
All right, our final presenters are Alicia Hofelich Mohr, and she is the Research Support Coordinator in the Liberal Arts Technologies and Innovation Services at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. She works with researchers on writing data management plans, designing reproducible research workflows, handling human participant data, and ethically sharing data. Joel Herndon is also going to present, and he is the director of the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences at Duke University Libraries, where he directs a library data program providing support for data visualization, data curation, data management, digital mapping, and data science support for the Duke community. Cynthia Hudson Vitale is the Director of Science Policy and Scholarship at the Association of Research Libraries. She advances the association's mission of open, equitable scholarly communication, information stewardship, and publishing with key partners, allies, and joint ventures.
This one? Whoops. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Joel Herndon, and I'm joined today by Alicia Hofelich. We are both part of the NSF-funded Realities of Academic Data Sharing project, and we're happy to share some of our research. We're based out of the Association of Research Libraries. For the last year and a half, we've been working across 6 institutions across the U.S., representing both public and private universities, looking at really 3 research questions. First of all, where researchers are sharing their data, and what is the quality of that metadata, which we're going to focus on today in our presentation. We've talked to a lot of researchers about decisions that they make about how and why they're going to share their research data. And finally, an interest in many institutions in the US about what is the actual cost to the institution of this federally mandated data sharing that's happening increasingly across the United States. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Alicia.
All right, thank you. We'll be presenting this in 3 acts. As Joel mentioned, our goals of this research question was to know where's the data? Where are researchers from our institution sharing their published research data, code, software underlying their work? So here are our goals. So we set out to identify the location of this published research data over the last 10 years. We wanted to search DOI registries. We know there's APIs out there. We can just, take a big net of all the data. We know that there's metadata associated with DOIs, so we don't have to search through the articles specifically. And so we wanted to parse affiliation across our 6 institutions using our research organization registry IDs, or RORs. That was our goal. And we wanted to facet results by subject keywords and funder ID because we're interested in public use data. Those are all metadata fields and DOIs. Done, easy, right? Well, the best laid plans. So we were able to get data from the past 10 years. One thing we found for our application programming interfaces, or APIs, is that they vary. Both in accessibility and in speed, how long it would take us to get all this data. So we needed to combine approaches using some APIs, some public use data sets. Turns out no one uses RORs in the data set metadata, or data site metadata, DOI metadata. So instead we had to text search our institution names, which there are many institutions that have the word Michigan in it, for example. So that was extra work. And it turns out, surprisingly, maybe not, there's limited and inconsistent use of funder IDs, funding information, subject keywords are very different in the data set metadata. So we just scrapped those plans. So what we did, this is another illustration that has the numbers and the specific metadata searches of what we did. We looked at 2 DOI registration agencies that mint DOIs in the US, DataCite and Crossref. So you could see we searched affiliation name, publication year, and resource type, either dataset or software in DataCite. Crossref only had a dataset. They didn't have a software type, so we searched dataset. We used the Crossref public dataset, and we ended up with almost 180,000 DOIs. So our first kind of win, what's here, our first finding, is we found data. We found all the data. So this was pretty exciting, and you could see on the x-axis we have each institution with their corresponding color there, and you can see we found from just over 2,000 research data DOIs to over 150,000. So Michigan actually had so many it broke my y-axis. You can see it had to be rescaled. So we were excited to dig in and see what was there. Well, it turns out We didn't find all the data. We found almost all the data. So as part of our work here, all of us at our 6 institutions were affiliated with or worked closely with our institutional data repositories. So these were places where we knew researchers from our institution were sharing their data. And so we wanted to know, how do these stack up compared to all the other places people are sharing data? And so, for example, at Minnesota, I knew at the time we had 692 data sets, and it's worth saying all of us issue DOIs, either through dataset or Crossref, for our data sets. But when we looked in the data we pulled, our institution repositories were absent. So we only found, for example, in Minnesota, 90 DOIs, when I was expecting 692, because I know each of them have DOIs. Well, what turned out is that even though all authors from our institutions were affiliated with our institutions, and we know that because that's why they have access to our repositories, none of us actually entered or consistently entered the affiliation metadata field in DataCite when we made DOIs. So that is a recommended but not required field. So when we searched on it, we didn't find the things that were missing affiliation, which turns out was us. Because it was important to us, both institutionally and for our research reports, to include our institutional repositories, we went back and did another search. And so we searched for our repositories by publisher name. Again, we were able to do this for our repositories because we knew everyone was affiliated with our institutions. So 5 of us used Dataset. Duke at the time used Crossref, so we pulled in through another search, another about 2,000 DOIs. Okay, now where's the data? So now we have, it's worth noting that there is a very long tail of places people are publishing. So we had 176 different publishers or repositories we found in this data set. And it's worth knowing, too, that there are very few in each of them. So only about 55 of these repositories had more than 10 DOIs. So really long tail. So these are the top 10 by publisher, and the bars are filled in by the university affiliations. So notice a couple things. So one is that this huge axis breaking Michigan data are mostly coming from this OnCode Data Coordination Center repository. Digging a little closer, we found this was mostly from a single researcher over a single year. So pin on that, something interesting going on there. We also saw another repository we were unfamiliar with in the data landscape, which is Faculty Opinions Ltd. Turns out that's not actually data, but a journal that reviews data articles. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But among the ones we knew, we were also really surprised about how many data sets were in certain repositories, Harvard Dataverse being one of it. We dug a little bit deeper and found that most of those, again, Michigan representing, were from a single researcher too. So we were a little perplexed. We dug a little bit deeper and found that some repositories that we're finding are issuing DOIs at different levels. So some repositories issue a DOI or were issuing DOIs for a study, a collection of files, whereas others, and this example is from Harvard Dataverse, is in our data set we had the study DOI, but also a separate DOI for each of the files. And so in this particular example, there are almost 2,500 files. So each of those were a DOI that were counted as one data set in our file. So that was making things hard to compare apples to apples when we're looking at repositories. So one thing we were able to do here is collapse based on DOIs that were related to each other through container metadata. So we did that. So we're like, all right, so we're going to collapse, so we only count the study DOI and not all these data sets DOIs. Now where's the top data? Okay, so we retooled this again. We have our top. You can see now those 2 that I flagged earlier, OnCode Data Coordination Center and Faculty Opinions Ltd. are the largest bars here, followed by other repositories that we more or less expected. So Zenodo included a lot of GitHub citations, our institutional repositories, Figshare. Taylor and Francis is actually part of Figshare too, but published by Taylor and Francis. But this was interesting, and I'm going to shift this graph a little bit and show you this another way. And so now I have each institution as its own bars. And so you can see the distribution of all the DOIs as a percent on where they're being published from. And so a couple takeaways here is that all the bar heights, so these 10 institutions, are representing over 90 to 95% of the DOIs we found for our institutions. And you can see these top two are just like annihilating the proportion, especially for Michigan, faculty LTD being one. We tried to do some digging to see whether we could exclude those or how to interpret them. Faculty opinions LTD, we found that they are writing it as a data set. They're using that metadata flag. But it's actually a relic because when they started publishing these article reviews, they didn't know what to call it. So it's separate DOI from the article that they're reviewing, so they just called it a data set. And so they haven't changed, they confirmed it's not data. Bless you. And so then we could remove that. And so just to show you without those top two resources, this is what it looks like. And so this is now a new top 10 without those. We're still capturing over 90% of the DOIs we found for institutions. You can see that now each institution looks fairly similar in the pattern of repositories across, with Zenodo and Dryad being at the top. Our institutional repositories are represented. And of course, Michigan is seeing quite a big number of ICPSR repositories. But more importantly than what we found is what we didn't find. And so for that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel.
Oops. So for our third act, after we went through looking at the data, we did have some questions about what we were seeing, and one of them was, what are we missing as part of this project? When we had started the project, we feel like we made a fairly reasonable assumption that we wanted to find published data sets, and we wanted to look for DOI specifically, which is kind of a hallmark of published data sets. We felt that was a fairly reasonable assumption. Since the ISO standard was published for DOIs in 2012, there's just been a surge of DOIs being minted, we know. And indeed, faculty members tell us on our campus that they see the DOI as kind of a signature of, I published my data, there's quality right here. But going into my astronomy analogy, the instrument we used came back with a beautiful picture. DOIs are bright and visible in what we were looking at. But we realized that the data sharing space that we're exploring is really vast, and our instruments that we were using didn't catch all of the indicators out there. Their handles, archival resource keys, some people use accession numbers, and we know there's dark matter out there, or there's data out there that has no registered identifier. We see it on the web, we see it on file shares, we know it's happening, but we just can't see it inside of the DOI space, so we know we've got some things that are missing. I think the second issue we're bumping into is that even DOIs present assessment challenges. There are multiple registration agencies for DOIs. We worked through 2 of those in our project. There are issues of metadata completeness. Everyone completes the required fields to get the DOI, but there are many other fields that are out there. Granularity, which we can talk about in Q&A, but Alicia, I think, covered really well about what is the item we're measuring and trying to assess. And indeed, there are many things that are coded as data that may not be data. Software, for example, which we did include in our study because we were interested in software sharing. So we had bias in our data set. We thought we were looking in the middle of a normal distribution, seeing what was out there from most of the DOI granting repositories, and we realized we're really looking in the better funded repositories that can provide that richer metadata. And the results we're showing you are not probably the most representative. But when we pull back a little further, what we really suspect is we're looking in the tail end of the distribution for data sharing with well-resourced institutions and well-resourced repositories. And there is a lot of sharing both in repositories and in the general just sharing space where there aren't DOIs for these types of data. And so I think the thing we want to engage with you today is that this is a hard struggle, both for institutions that are trying to produce quality metadata and for those trying to assess what's being shared out there in the space. There are questions of capacity and resource availability that affect all of us, no matter where you are, staff, expertise, the amount of time that you have to put into describing research data, a question of balancing description and discovery for your data sets. We all would ideally include all of the metadata fields and all the identifiers, but there's a time issue there and a project issue, and so we do have to make trade-offs. the challenge of keeping up with multiple evolving data standards, which is a great thing and that we can be more specific, but a challenge in trying to keep our data indeed as well described as we can with those standards. And finally, a question of correction of data being time-consuming. I think the good news I have to offer with you, one thing we definitely learned during this project, and we're glad to work with the 6 institutions in the IASSIST community, is that communication and working with the community has enabled us to do our work better, and actually lets us talk about how we've tried to solve some of these challenges and problems across institutions, and has helped us while we're developing our services and working with the IASSIST community to share better data and make it more discoverable. And so we're very optimistic about the future of data sharing and making it more representable. And we'll close for questions.
Am I good? Okay. All right. Well, these were awesome presentations. I learned a lot. I'm sure you all did as well. And I checked with Jen. We currently have no online questions, so we can start with our audience. So I'm going to bring this to you if you have a question. Who's ready?
Hi. I came in a little bit late. I think I only got part 2 and part 3. Sorry about that. But it seems to me we should, as repository managers, get better at the correction part. And you identified in the part 2 about things that could be corrected, such as adding the institution to the affiliation field. And I was just going to share, we discovered recently, and I think it was to do with something getting missed when either data site metadata schema got updated with our crosswalk not corresponding anymore, or with our DSpace upgrade. I'm not quite sure where it went wrong, but all of a sudden we noticed that in the data site search engine that our data sets were coming up as data creator unknown, which wasn't very good. But we were able to fix the crosswalk and get it propagated through again, so now they're showing up. And I'm going to take away that thing, that idea about affiliation, because we're probably not adding that field either. So I guess that's sort of a comment/question. And also, did you try searching by the DOI stem? Because that's, yeah, of course. Okay, so I don't know if you have a comment on that story or not.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is working. Yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, really good point and comment. And actually, some of our collaboration on this work was with Ted Haberman of Metadata Game Changers. And so he, as part of this with some of our institutions, was able to write some Python code to go back and take metadata that was in our repository and not properly crosswalked and update those DOIs. He did it for a few, and then, you know, the grant funding kind of ended, and so now we're left with some scripts that we haven't rerun. Many of us have changed. We're adding the ROARs now when we think to, when we have time to, in our repositories. But yeah, I think it is possible to change it, which is great. But I do want to acknowledge too, like if you have the technical ability or someone who can do that easily, it can be really nice. But that's another piece of the puzzle, that like staffing and time to do that. But yeah, and so actually that's how I looked, the STEM question I think is a good one for publisher, and that's actually how the Duke's repository, when they were in Crossref, were identified by the STEM of the DOI. I don't know if you have other things to add to that.
I think one thing we didn't talk about in the presentation is we found a lot of our institutions in this study had richer metadata that was locally held but had not made it to DataCite. And so as a part of the study, we were quite surprised by that. You know, it set off in each institution a search to figure out, it's like, why is this the case? And indeed, can we add more, amend our data inside of DataCite so that it's better exposed? So that was very helpful for us, and it gave us things to share, about workflows to try to make things more visible.
Can I just clarify? Oh, for my remote. Sorry.
Thanks. Sophia, I really wanted to applaud your courage in your presentation today, especially since LGBTQ people are criminalized in your country. I was just wondering if there are other instances of data collection in Africa, say, for example, maybe in South Africa.
Yes, like I said, we have several data collection institutes, but because the LGBTQ are, they are somehow criminalized, so nobody wants to do a research or, do anything about it. I remember, like I said, when I was excited that, my paper was accepted and I'll be presenting. And anytime I share with friends, they're like, oh, what are you trying to do? Do you get it now? So we have several data center. We have IASSIST in University of Ibadan. I know UNILAG, the first generation universities, they have information data collection center, but we are not allowed to talk about this. It is not officially, because if the government could criminalize and putting them to 40 years imprisonment, so you cannot even talk. You cannot come out and you cannot be bold to tell people your sexual preference, your sexual orientation. So everything is done in Thank you.
Ready, Robin? Oh, Sophia, could you put your list, your references? Yes, there's a request to see your references if you want to. All right, well, she's getting that. Other questions? How about from our panelists? Anything more you'd like to add? Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to share too, I'm actually really happy about the RADS project just from a Duke perspective, because now we actually are in DataCite. So I think that I just want to share that because it was a really great way to show the reasons to be in this global infrastructure. And so it just makes me happy, this project, as much as it was a learning experience. And I think it also shows some of our flaws in the field, right? That we're still learning these things, we're still learning how to do it better. And I think being able to acknowledge that as a group, it's not really a question, but more of just an acknowledgement that I think showing this is still an evolving space, this is still a space where we're learning how to do it better. Like, I keep thinking about how do we do identifiers better, right? How do we do roars right? How do we do orchids right? How do we do all these things when we are limited with our infrastructure, when we are limited with our resources? And so I don't know if other people in the room have questions or thoughts on how they're approaching that within their institution, but I think it can be a challenge. So that's all I got.
And I was really struck by the inability to find your institutions because they weren't listed in the DOI, right? That the metadata hadn't been entered, so it just simply hadn't been entered. So the opportunity for education is obviously huge, but when you've got a graduate student who's moving about, like which institution gets entered for the data, that gets really complicated. I can understand why they don't. Or teams of people from different places, which institution gets the citation or whatever. But all of these problems are things that IASSIST is here to address. So all you new folks who are here, This is why you're here. Thank you. Thank you for being here. But also, in the session right before this, we started, the presenter was started by saying, look, people who want to have standards say that it's dictatorial and it's bad, but standards matter, and we all need to be the ones to figure out what are the standards, how do they apply, and how can we keep them equitable and shareable and discoverable. And you know, maybe some of these standards will be adopted by Nigeria, and we can help with making it normalized to have subpopulations identified in safe ways. It's just normal. It's a thing that the world does. Nigeria picks it up. Things get better. So these are the kinds of conversations that in our small little IASSIST session here are making a change in the world. One little thing, one little DOI entry at a time. I just wanted to make sure that didn't get lost in all of our minutia here.
Thanks, Paula. That really resonates with me. And I think, you know, you can think of metadata and standards as being something that makes data work easier. But also, we want them to be truth, right? We want to be able to do the easy data work, to compile the data, present it to the decision makers, the policy makers, the public, in ways that are truthful. And I think one thing we were surprised at, which maybe we shouldn't have been surprised at, but you know, we could have done this study and had a nice graph and not seen our institutional repositories. And then the higher ups would be, well, everyone's publishing in this OnCode or Harvard Dataverse or, you know, wherever. Why are we investing in repositories? Why, you know, and the way that, you know, the way we share and present data can can affect people, can affect the lives of people and the criminalization of people for who they are. And it's just, I'm just struck by how powerful it is. So, yeah.
Thanks very much for all of the presentations, but I'm going to circle back again to the DOIs and the PIDs and all that. I had the occasion in preparation for a talk I gave earlier today to chat with Kelly Stathis at DataCite, and she and a number of other people just recently authored a report that's in Zenodo. Don't ask me for the citation, it's in my presentation, that highlights a fair workflow project. And it outlines the different stages throughout the entire data lifecycle where DOIs or PIDs, persistent identifiers, should be applied. And I think if we can layer that kind of a workflow on top of the myriad of workflows that exist in the research world, we would all be benefiting immensely. And I hate saying it, Joel, but perhaps the solution is time. As time goes forward, the numbers of files that will hopefully have decent DOIs and everything in there will grow, and the numbers that are in the rearview mirror that we have very little hope of, you know, DOIing, if that's a verb, will gradually diminish in proportions. But I think right now your research really speaks to the argument for doing better DOIs.
Yep, that's a really good point, and I remembered my minutia. But it related to the standards thing. So Joel, you said that you know, that it was a shame that the richer metadata that the institutions had in their repositories didn't get passed on into the DataCite database. And I think that might be because, like with crosswalks, DataCite can be quite strict with how its fields are done, and you can't always just specify a crosswalk that makes that work. So, because we should probably be moving ours to DataCite. We should probably have done that by now, and we're waiting for our DSpace 7 upgrade to think about it. But we are going to miss some of the things we do with our own schema based on extended Dublin core. So, for example, we can put in the information that we have at the time of the paper that the data set is related to, and sometimes that's like in press or accepted for publication with this particular publisher, and And then sometimes our amazing team sometimes even does Google alerts to like check on the date when it's supposed to get published or when it's supposed to get accepted to update that. But DataCite only accepts a DOI, so we often don't have the DOI of the paper because it's the publisher who wants to get the DOI of the data set before they publish. So so we don't always have that, but that's the strict kind of field that you need for DataCite. So I'm sure there's lots of those kinds of reasons why the rich metadata isn't getting in, but it's still a good point.
I think one thing that we learned that it was painful. So we had great guidance from Ted Haberman, who is definitely a metadata expert and has worked hard on the DataCite standard. But learning more about this as part of this project, the gap between the theory of how you should mint DOIs and the metadata fields, and so as I learned more about what we were missing and what was possible, talking to Ted, I grew very excited. It's like, well, we'll do this, and it'll be perfect, and it'll work out. And then as we looked at, how does it work in practice at universities where you have limited staff, you have repository infrastructure which may fight against some of these metadata fields that you want to include, but the platform makes it difficult to include them. Questions of timing as far as how fast you can work through or deposit a collection. There are just a lot of things that in the practice that aren't included in the theory that really, as we heard this morning, kind of bring you to a pragmatism moment about we're aware that we can do better and that there are these ideals we're trying to reach, but we've got to actually keep the workflow going and find a way to maximize what's good. I remember asking that to Ted and Ted laughing a bit when I was like, well, what would maximize this, or the absolute things? And he's like, these are required, and these I really would strongly suggest. So it's kind of where you as a group and the group you're working with or as an individual can take it and trying to kind of do the best you can as you're publishing these.
We have a question online now from Megan O'Donnell. There is concern in the scholarly publishing world about metadata and reporting equity regarding small and independent publishers not being able to make new federal reporting requirements in the U.S. Do you think data will also need to address this?
I will say absolutely yes. We have been looking at, this is not part of this presentation, some of the cost issues in complying with federal data sharing mandates and have heard different things. We have questions about operation, using fancy words, about defining that concept and what we're measuring about the cost of data management and curation. So that is a bit of a struggle at the moment. But I think the presentation you're seeing today is revealing that if you want to be a DOI minting institution, there's a charge for that. I mean, the service has some cost, and the staffing to actually provide the metadata has their cost all through the system. At the moment, it's a little bit difficult to calculate what that is, but we're in the opening stages at this point. There are many different groups looking at kind of what does that look like. There's been work done on this before. There is a literature on the cost of data curation and management. But it's complex enough where different groups that have looked at this over time have kind of looked at this through different lenses and used different models to assess what that is. But I do think it's a reality that there are going to be some difficulties for organizations that are not as well funded to comply with these mandates, coming back to the question.
Okay, got it, yeah. So I just wanted to comment on the issue that Robin brought up about the challenge associated with trying to publish the data and some of the constraints involved there. And so one of the things that we're seeing as a result of the changes that have taken place in the last decade or so, with, for instance, the publishers now being aware that the data should be available, which is a great thing. But when you, and as Joel was saying earlier, things change a little bit when you compare theory with practice. And so what we are seeing often now is that the data creators will write their manuscript and they will submit it for publication. And then at some point along the way, the journal will say, well, we need to have access to your data and need a DOI for that. And of course, the article authors, what they're just thinking is, okay, I need a DOI for the data. And so that manifests itself in a lot of different behaviors. The easy thing to do is to go to some of these popular generalist repositories, and we know who they are, and just, you know, pop in your data with whatever limited information you can put in to get the DOI. You got your DOI, you give it to the publisher, and you can move on. You know, that's one manifestation of the behavior. But another way is the data producers realize, well, you know, we do need to do something about these data. And even though it's an afterthought, they realize that we should try to get them out to the community that's going to use them and try to do a good job. So then they'll contact a data repository and say, I need a DOI for this today. And we have to get the data published right away so that the reviewers can access the data. It has to be publicly accessible. And you know, we want to get this article out because people are waiting for their tenure decisions and promotions and all this other stuff. You know, whole careers depend on this. And so, you know, as a data repository getting these kinds of requests, the domain repositories that are serving specific communities want to do a good job, but of course, doing it all in one day or even a couple of days or even a couple of weeks can become challenging, especially if there's very limited information about the data. And, you know, as some of you have already indicated, you know, it's time consuming to create the metadata. Well, if you're going to be producing the data and publishing it, you have to work with the data producers a little bit to ensure that there's sufficient information about the data, including, for instance, the quality information. And if the reviewers of the articles aren't really reviewing the data, they're just reviewing the articles, you can't really just rely on that to say that the data have been reviewed. And so an additional level of, or might be the only level of data review, might need to be then done. And so getting all that done within a 1 or 2 week period to satisfy the data producers so that they can meet their publishing deadlines can be very challenging. So, and there are ways we can issue a DOI. Of course, you can put up a draft DOI and give it to the publisher, but that doesn't mean the data are available for the article reviewers to look at. Some look at them, some don't. But certainly the publisher wants the data to be publicly accessible. We've had some success in working with publishers saying, well, you know, we want to make sure that by the time we get these publicly accessible, we've got something that the public can actually use, you know, and some are working with us in that way, and so they can move on with their process knowing that the data will be published, but it is a bit of a challenge there, and you know, these kinds of changes aren't always anticipated, and ways to resolve them, but I think as a community, we have to look at ways in which we can find a better approach or better approaches, I guess, to see how we can address these kinds of challenges going forward.
Any other questions from our audience? They've given us a lot to think about. They've given us a lot to think about, very much. Well, I want to thank Sophia and Alicia and Joel and Robert and John for their excellent presentation. Thank you so much for your audience participation, and we will see you at the next session. Thank you.